The night I found the receipt, I was folding laundry at the dining table, the hum of the dryer filling the silence of our house. It slipped from the pocket of Mark's neatly pressed shirt, a crisp slip of paper no bigger than my palm. My eyes skimmed the print without intention, just the reflex of habit, and there it was, a hotel charge from a Tuesday afternoon, the same Tuesday. He told me he had been stuck in meetings clear across town. My breath caught, as if someone had pulled a cord inside my chest. The smell of fresh cotton on the laundry suddenly turned bitter, like the faint scent of perfume I thought I imagined weeks ago when he hugged me goodnight. I stood there frozen, the receipt trembling between my fingers, knowing life had just tilted on its axis. Before I tell you more, let me pause for a moment. I want you to share in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more stories of love betrayal and the quiet ways we reclaim justice. It matters more than you think. My name is Elena Brooks, and for most of my adult life, I believed I had chosen well. I grew up in a modest household where my father worked long shifts at the paper mill, and my mother stretched every dollar into meals that filled us and left us with enough for Sunday pie. Hard work and faithfulness weren't just values, they were survival. By the time I married Mark, I thought I had found a man who understood those rhythms. He was charming, steady, always the first to pull out a chair for me at a restaurant, and the one who insisted I never carry groceries alone. I built a quiet pride in being his partner, standing beside him at company dinners, smiling when coworkers praised how solid we seemed. Mark's career was demanding, traveling from one client dinner to the next, but he carried it well, or so I thought. He liked to tell me I was his anchor, the reason he could walk into a boardroom with confidence. I wanted to believe him. We had our daughter, Lily, who filled our home with laughter and whose teenage wit kept us both on our toes. From the outside, we looked like the family people admired, a brick house with a well-kept lawn, holiday lights each December, and a kitchen table that seemed to hold us together. I kept busy with counseling work at the high school, and Mark always said he was proud of how much the kids trusted me. We had, it seemed, a good rhythm. But as the years passed, there were subtle shifts. Mark's late nights became more frequent, explained by client dinners that grew longer and travel that stretched closer to home. I told myself it was the price of success, that the exhaustion in his eyes meant he was carrying more for us. When Tessa, my longtime friend, began planning more events for Mark's company, I thought nothing of it. She had been around since our college days, and her laughter always filled the corners of our gatherings. It was easier to believe the story I had told myself for years than to question why Mark's phone was always face down on the counter, or why Lily sometimes asked if Dad was really as busy as he claimed. Looking back, the cracks had been forming quietly, like hairline fractures in glass you don't notice until the whole pane gives way. That night, with the laundry staring at the hotel receipt, I felt those fractures widening, sharp and irreversible. The questions flooded in. How long? Why her? Did everyone else already know? But I didn't cry. Not then. Instead, I slid the receipt into my pocket and smoothed the last shirt on the table, folding it into perfect squares, as if order could still be salvaged. I knew deep down that I couldn't ignore this proof that life, as I had framed it, was already slipping from my hands. And as I turned off the dining room light and climbed the stairs, I realized one truth with chilling clarity: this was only the beginning. The receipt stayed in my pocket for 2 days before I let myself touch it again. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding, that there could be an innocent explanation, but the thought didn't settle. Each time, Mark smiled across the table or brushed a quick kiss against my cheek on his way out the door, I felt that slip of paper burning like an ember against my skin. I went through the motions at work, guiding students through their own storms, while a quiet storm of my own grew heavier inside me. On Thursday evening, Mark came home late, carrying the faint scent of cologne I didn't recognize. He leaned in to hug me, and I noticed it lingered differently than the one he usually wore. I stood there with folded arms as he talked about traffic and deadlines, nodding as though his words meant something, when all I could hear was the shallow rhythm of his voice, avoiding detail. Lily had already gone upstairs, leaving us in the kitchen under the yellow light that suddenly felt too harsh, every angle sharper than before. The next morning, while he showered, his phone buzzed on the counter. It was face down as always, the screen lighting briefly before dimming again. I wasn't the kind of woman who pried, but the instinct to flip it over nearly overtook me. My hands stayed at my sides, trembling faintly. When he stepped out wrapped in a towel, smiling like nothing in the world had shifted, I had to bite my tongue to keep from asking who had just written him. That weekend, we hosted a small dinner with friends, something Mark insisted we keep as a tradition every few months. Tessa arrived first, her arms full of wine and dessert. She kissed my cheek warmly, but her eyes darted past me toward Mark as he set the table. I had known her for more than 20 years, through awkward college phases and early motherhood. But lately, she seemed to glow differently when he was near. At the table, she laughed at every story he told, her hand brushing his arm lightly more than once. Each gesture might have been dismissed on its own, but together, they gathered like stones in my chest. When I went into the kitchen to fetch dessert plates, I paused at the doorway. I could hear them still talking, their voices lower, closer. "You're working too hard," she teased softly. His response was a chuckle that carried an intimacy I hadn't heard in months. By the time I stepped back into the room, they were sitting apart again, casual, as if nothing had passed between them. I set down the plates smiling, but my hand shook enough that the silverware rattled against the porcelain. Later that night, when the house was quiet, I opened the laundry drawer and slipped the receipt out. I laid it on the table and stared at the printed lines until my vision blurred. The date, the hotel name, the total, it all sat there in black and white. I thought of how I had trusted his words about endless meetings, how many nights I had eaten dinner alone while he was stuck at work. My throat tightened, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, a hollow calm took root, the same kind of stillness I had felt before delivering difficult news to a parent at school. On Sunday morning, Lily asked if we could go shopping for her prom dress. I agreed quickly, grateful for the distraction. We wandered through racks of shimmering fabric and lace, her chatter about colors and styles filling the space. For a few hours, I almost forgot the heaviness pressing against me. Watching her twirl in front of the mirror, radiant, in a pale blue gown, I thought of all the times I had promised her stability, a home built on trust. My heart ached at the thought of what she might sense if she looked too closely. That evening, while Lily worked on homework, Mark sat across from me in the living room, flipping through channels as though the week had been ordinary. He asked if I was tired, if something was on my mind, his tone light and unbothered. I wanted to scream, to throw the receipt in his lap and demand the truth, but my voice stayed steady. "Just a long week," I said, folding a blanket neatly across my knees. His eyes lingered on me for a moment, searching, but he let it pass. The first crack had opened wide enough to see through, and I couldn't unsee what lay beyond. Each smile, each excuse, each lingering glance with Tessa only deepened the fracture. And though I sat in silence, the weight of betrayal settled firmly, whispering that the life I thought I had built was already beginning to crumble. As I turned off the lamp that night, leaving the room in shadow, I understood that pretending would not hold much longer. The questions I had tried to bury were clawing their way to the surface, demanding answers. And whether I wanted them or not, those answers were coming. Nights grew heavier after that dinner. though Mark never seemed to notice. He carried on with his meetings, his late arrivals, and his vague explanations while I folded myself into silence. Some evenings, I sat in Lily's room, pretending to help her study, when really I was clinging to the safety of her laughter and her steady presence. When she asked if I was tired, I would smile and blame it on long days at school, but the truth pressed harder than exhaustion. I tried to believe that I could endure it quietly, that the unease might settle if I ignored it long enough. Yet the smallest things began to gnaw at me. The faint scent of perfume on Mark's jacket that didn't belong to me. A lingering smile when he glanced at his phone before quickly tucking it away. Even the way his voice softened on certain calls, a low hum that carried familiarity I hadn't heard directed at me in months. Each sign carved away at the certainty I once held. At school, I found myself staring out my office window longer than usual, the laughter of teenagers echoing faintly through the hallways. It struck me how quickly they trusted me with their secrets, while I couldn't bring myself to name my own. My colleague Sandra stopped by one afternoon with papers in hand and a gentle look in her eyes. "You okay, Elena?" she asked softly. I forced a smile and told her I was fine. Though my hands trembled around the pen I held, the silence at home became its own language. Mark would sit across from me at the table, fork tapping lightly against his plate, asking about my day in a way that felt practiced. I answered briefly, watching the shadows move across his face, wondering who he truly spoke to when I wasn't there. The man I had once leaned on now felt like a stranger sharing my roof, and that realization ached more than anger ever could. One evening, I found myself sitting alone in the kitchen long after Lily had gone to bed. The receipt lay hidden in the drawer beside me, its presence undeniable, yet I couldn't bring myself to confront him. Instead, I traced the rim of my coffee mug slowly, the silence of the house broken only by the ticking of the clock. My chest felt tight, not from rage, but from the quiet grief of watching something slip away without a fight. When Mark finally walked in, loosening his tie and offering a tired smile, I studied him carefully. He kissed the top of my head, casual, unthinking, as though nothing between us had shifted. I wanted to stop him, to hold up the truth in front of his face, but my voice failed me. I simply nodded and let him move past me, the words caught in my throat. My tears came later, silently pressed into the pillow, while the sound of his even breathing filled the room beside me. The following days blurred together. I moved through my routines with mechanical precision, each step carefully measured. In the mirror, I saw shadows under my eyes, the kind that no amount of makeup could disguise. Lily noticed once, asking if I was sick, and I hugged her tightly, telling her it was nothing. But I could see the worry in her gaze, a reflection of what I was too afraid to say aloud. Every small discovery deepened the hollow ache, an unexplained charge on the credit card, a half-truth about a dinner that didn't line up with his calendar, a phone call cut short when I entered the room. None of it was loud, none of it dramatic, but together it built a wall I couldn't climb over. I was mourning quietly in pieces, and he didn't even see it. It was during one of those nights, staring at the ceiling in the dark, that I realized my silence was not protecting me at all. It was protecting him. The weight of what I carried pressed down harder with every passing day until even breathing felt like a conscious effort. And though I had not yet spoken the truth, I knew it was only a matter of time before it demanded to be heard. For now, I buried it, holding my calm like a fragile glass that might shatter if I moved too quickly. But the cracks were widening, and I could already hear the faint sound of breaking. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when the weight of silence finally grew too heavy to carry. Mark had texted that he would be late again, blaming a meeting that had supposedly run long. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, staring at the empty chair across from me. The lamp above flickered faintly, throwing long shadows against the wall. And I thought of how often I had eaten meals alone while telling myself it was only temporary. When the front door finally opened, I didn't rise to greet him. He set his briefcase down and loosened his tie, humming as though nothing had shifted between us. I studied his face, the calmness he wore so easily, and something inside me hardened. My hand slid into my pocket, feeling the folded receipt I had carried for weeks. Without a word, I placed it on the table in front of him. Mark froze mid-motion, his eyes flicking down to the slip of paper. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the air so still it felt brittle. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low but strained. I kept my tone steady. "From your shirt pocket. The same night you said you were at the office." He tried to smile, the corners of his mouth twitching as though charm might erase the truth. "It was a client dinner, Elena. The hotel was convenient, that's all." His explanation was practiced, but I saw the falter in his eyes. My chest tightened, though not with the grief I expected. Instead, a quiet clarity washed over me. I leaned back, folding my arms. Convenient enough to hide. Convenient enough to lie about. My words hung between us, sharper than I intended. He opened his mouth again, but no answer came. Only silence that told me more than any confession could. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to his steady breathing beside me, wondering how many times I had believed a story that wasn't real. The hurt was deep, but beneath it, another feeling stirred resolve. I realized I couldn't keep living in the half-light of doubt. The truth was here, and I could no longer ignore it. The next morning, I left for work earlier than usual. The drive was quiet. The trees along the road blurred in the dawn light. At school, I moved through my schedule meeting with students signing reports, smiling when needed. Yet under the surface, a new steadiness had taken root. Every word he had spoken the night before replayed in my mind, each one building a case I could no longer dismiss. That afternoon, I stopped by Walter's house on my way home. He was sitting on the porch with a glass of iced tea, the sun catching the silver in his hair. He looked up when he saw me, his eyes narrowing with concern. "You look worn out, Elena," he said, setting his glass aside. I sat beside him, the wooden chair creaking beneath me. For a while, I said nothing, just letting the hum of cicadas fill the quiet. When I finally spoke, my voice was soft, but certain. "Walter, I think Mark has been lying to me. More than once." His hand tightened around the armrest, though his expression stayed calm. "I was afraid of that," he murmured. His words caught me off guard, but I didn't press him then. Instead, I told him about the receipt, about the late nights, about the shift I had felt for months. He listened without interruption, only nodding slowly, as if piecing together a puzzle he already knew too well. Before I left, Walter placed a steady hand on mine. "Don't let him turn this into your fault," he said firmly. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. As I drove home, his words echoed inside me, steadying me more than I expected. That evening, Mark tried to act as though nothing had happened. He set the table, asked Lily about her day, even complimented the pasta I had cooked. I played along for her sake, though my heart was elsewhere. Each smile he offered felt like a mask, each gesture rehearsed. I realized then that his performance was not for me, it was for himself, to convince the world he hadn't already broken what mattered most. When the house finally quieted, I sat in the darkened living room, the soft tick of the clock marking each passing moment. My reflection stared back at me from the window, pale and resolute. I knew the time for silence had ended. I couldn't go back to the comfort of believing half-truths, not when the full truth was standing so plainly before me. And as I sat there, gathering the pieces of strength I had left, I understood that this was not just about betrayal. It was about choosing myself, about refusing to live as a shadow in my own home. The decision was no longer if I would act, it was when. The morning after I confronted Mark with the receipt, I woke before the alarm. The sky outside was still gray, the first light slipping over the horizon, but my thoughts were already racing. He stirred beside me, unaware that I had been awake half the night, sorting through the fragments of our life and the lies buried within it. For years, I had chosen to believe his words smoothing over the cracks because I wanted to keep our family intact. Now I felt something shifting inside me, a new steadiness that surprised me with its clarity. At work, I carried myself as though nothing had changed, greeting students, answering emails, listening to small dramas unfold in my office. But beneath the calm surface, I began laying the first bricks of my own plan. Quietly, carefully, I started gathering what I needed. During lunch breaks, I logged into the household accounts, tracing through months of transactions I had once ignored. There were dinners that stretched beyond business hours, hotel charges that didn't belong to his work trips, and cash withdrawals that left no explanation. Each detail was tucked away, organized into a private folder I knew he would never find. That evening, while Mark was distracted with his phone, I walked to the study and opened the bottom drawer of the desk. Years earlier, we had filed away copies of Lisa's insurance papers and our joint tax returns. I sifted through them methodically, separating what mattered from what could be used against me later. It was tedious work, but each page placed in my bag felt like a quiet act of defiance. By the time I closed the drawer, my resolve had solidified. I would no longer be the woman waiting for his lies to reveal themselves. Over the next week, I kept my movements steady and deliberate. I scheduled a coffee with a trusted colleague, someone who had seen me through difficult years before. Sandra listened as I spoke in careful phrases, never naming Tessa directly, but hinting at the betrayal I could no longer ignore. She nodded slowly, her hand covering mine, and promised discretion. That small act of being heard gave me strength, reminding me that isolation was exactly what Mark depended on to keep control. At home, I continued to play the part of the patient wife, but behind the calm smiles, I was no longer blind. I noticed the way his eyes lit up when a message buzzed after dinner, how quickly he excused himself to the other room. I didn't follow, didn't ask questions. Instead, I let him believe I was too tired to notice while I quietly kept track of each inconsistency. One evening, after Lily had gone upstairs to study, I told Mark I needed to review the family budget with him. He brushed me off at first, muttering about a late call with a client. I pressed gently, sliding the printouts across the table, watching the flicker of discomfort cross his face. "You've been spending more than usual," I said evenly. "I think we need to get ahead of this before it becomes a problem." His jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "You worry too much, Elena. Everything's fine." I let him believe I was convinced, folding the papers neatly and tucking them away. But inside, I knew better. His denial confirmed what the numbers already told me. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat at my desk in the glow of a small lamp and wrote everything down: dates, places, amounts. My hand was steady, my thoughts sharper than they had been in months. Each line, inked onto the page, was a step toward reclaiming control. The hardest part was keeping my composure with Lily. She had begun to notice more, asking why her father seemed distracted, why I looked tired all the time. I told her I was fine, that sometimes marriage had its seasons of difficulty. She accepted my words for now, but I could see the questions forming in her eyes. Protecting her from the truth was a balance I struggled with, but I knew she needed me steady more than she needed me raw. One Saturday afternoon, Mark announced he would be attending a work retreat the following weekend. His explanation was casual, delivered while pouring himself coffee as though it was routine. I nodded, hiding the flicker of anger that threatened to surface. After he left the room, I noted the date and time, knowing I would find a way to confirm where he really planned to be. My days of blind trust were over. That night, I sat on the porch with Walter, listening to the low hum of crickets in the yard. He didn't press me for details, but he seemed to understand without words. "You're stronger than you think," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the fading light. I took a long breath, letting the weight of his support steady me. For the first time, I believed him. By the time Mark returned from his so-called retreat, my resolve had taken root. I no longer doubted the truth, no longer second-guessed the signs I had tried to ignore. The foundation of my life might have cracked, but I was no longer powerless in the rubble. And as I closed the door behind him that night, his smile as rehearsed as ever, I knew the time for silence was nearly over. The steps I had taken were small, careful, and deliberate, but they marked the beginning of something larger. I was no longer simply enduring. I was preparing. And soon, the quiet gathering of strength would no longer be hidden. The day of the gala arrived, and with it a quiet storm inside me. Mark had spoken of it for weeks, rehearsing his speech at the mirror, adjusting his tie, as though the entire evening depended on his performance. To everyone else, it was a celebration of his promotion, a recognition of his years of effort. To me, it had become something else entirely, the stage where his mask would finally crack. I dressed with deliberate care, choosing a dark navy gown I had worn only once before. As I fastened the clasp of my necklace, I studied myself in the mirror. My face looked calm, though my pulse was steady in a way that surprised me. When Lily peeked in, she smiled faintly. "You look beautiful, Mom," she whispered. I kissed her forehead, grateful for her quiet support. The ballroom shimmered with light as we arrived, chandeliers scattering reflections across polished floors. Waiters carried trays of champagne, and clusters of guests murmured in low conversation. I stayed near Mark's side, at first watching as he shook hands, laughing louder than usual, each gesture rehearsed for the crowd. Tessa entered not long after, her dress bright and striking, drawing attention the moment she stepped inside. She made her way toward us, her smile fixed, and for a brief second her eyes flicked toward Mark, with something too familiar to ignore. When the speeches began, I took a seat near the front, my hands folded neatly in my lap. Mark walked to the podium with practiced confidence, thanking colleagues, praising his team, offering a well-worn charm that drew polite laughter. But halfway through, Tessa raised her glass from the corner of the room, her voice cutting through the crowd. To Mark she declared for all the long nights, all the dedication, and for never failing to give more than anyone asked. The words were laced with meaning, her gaze steady on him, and the room stirred with murmurs. I felt the weight of eyes shifting toward me, some subtle, some not. My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass, but my face remained composed. When Mark hesitated, his practiced flow breaking for the briefest moment, I knew the time had come. I rose quietly, lifting my glass, my voice calm and measured. "And to truth," I said, "because eventually it always finds its way to the surface." The room fell into silence, the air brittle, every gaze now fixed on us. Mark's expression faltered, his smile thinning as though he were searching for the right words. I met his eyes steadily, holding his gaze without wavering. I didn't need to explain, didn't need to shout. The seed was planted, the silence heavy with unspoken truths that everyone could feel. My heart didn't race. It slowed, as if my body already knew the power had shifted. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of stiff conversation and sidelong glances. Mark tried to recover, clapping colleagues on the back, forcing laughter. but the easy confidence he wore so well had slipped. I moved through the room with quiet grace, speaking when spoken to, never revealing more than necessary. Tessa avoided me after that, her earlier boldness gone. Her smile forced as she lingered near the back of the room. On the ride home, Mark gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale against the leather. He didn't speak, and neither did I. The city lights flashed across the windshield, illuminating his strained jaw, the silence louder than any argument. When we pulled into the driveway, he finally muttered, "You embarrassed me tonight." I turned toward him, my voice calm even. "No, Mark. You embarrassed yourself." Inside, I slipped off my shoes and placed them neatly by the door. My movements were steady, deliberate, as though each gesture confirmed what I already knew. I was no longer afraid of his anger or his lies. Upstairs, I heard Lily moving quietly in her room, and I thought of the strength I needed to show her the example I wanted her to carry into her own life. That night, I lay in bed with my eyes open, listening to the sound of Mark shifting restlessly beside me. The mask had cracked, the truth had been given space to breathe, and there was no going back. I didn't know exactly what the days ahead would bring, but I knew this much: I had taken the first step out of silence, and the path forward was finally mine to choose. The question now was not whether the truth would come to light, but how far it would reach and who would still be standing when it did. The week after the gala unraveled quickly, faster than even I anticipated. Mark tried to maintain his composure in front of Lily, leaving for work at the usual time, speaking in the same practiced tone, but I could see the strain seeping through the cracks. His phone calls were shorter, sharper, often ending with him slamming the device onto the counter before retreating upstairs. Whatever confidence he had carried into that ballroom was gone, replaced by a desperate energy he couldn't mask. On Wednesday morning, I received a call from Sandra at work. She lowered her voice and told me she had overheard two parents in the school parking lot discussing the gala, whispering about Tessa's bold toast and my pointed response. It seemed word had traveled quickly, faster than Mark could control. By afternoon, I received another call, this time from one of his colleagues, a man I barely knew, who asked in a roundabout way if Mark was doing all right. The shift had begun subtle, but undeniable. The story was no longer his to control. That evening, when he walked through the door, his tie was loosened and his face pale. "We need to talk," he said, dropping heavily into the chair across from me. I folded my hands, waiting. "You've made me look like a fool," he muttered, his voice thick with anger. "Do you have any idea what people are saying?" My answer was simple. "They're saying the truth finally caught up with you." He flinched, and for a moment I thought he might shout, but instead he buried his face in his hands. By Friday, the fallout became official. Walter called me in the late afternoon, his voice steady, but tinged with quiet disappointment. "Elena," he said, "I heard from an old friend that Mark's company has launched a review. Too many questions about his conduct and about Tessa." My chest tightened, not with fear, but with the weight of inevitability. "What happens now?" I asked softly. Walter sighed. "They'll cut him loose. A man in his position can't survive scandal. He brought this on himself." When Mark returned home that evening, he carried a forced bravado. "They're overreacting," he said, pacing the living room. "It's office politics, nothing more." But his eyes darted nervously, and I knew he already sensed the end. I stayed quiet, letting his words collapse under their own weight. Lily, hearing the tension, lingered on the stairs, her face pale. I caught her eye and gave a small nod, signaling she didn't need to intervene. 2 days later, the official notice arrived. Mark's position was terminated effective immediately, his access revoked. He stormed through the house, slamming doors, railing against betrayal from his colleagues, even accusing me of poisoning his reputation. I listened without flinching, my silence more powerful than any argument. When he finally paused, breathless, I said evenly, "You did this to yourself, Mark, and everyone finally sees it." His face crumpled, anger giving way to desperation. Tessa's fall was just as swift. By the end of the week, she had been removed from several contracts, clients quietly distancing themselves after whispers of her involvement with Mark. I learned of it through Sandra, who had heard it from another teacher whose sister-in-law worked in event planning. The circle of their choices had closed in on them, and neither could escape the consequences. That Sunday, Walter invited me and Lily over for dinner. He greeted us warmly, pulling Lily into a hug before leading us to the table he had set with care. Over the meal, he spoke gently but firmly. "I know this has been painful," he said, "but I want you both to know you are not alone. Mark may be my son, but I won't defend what he's done." Lily's eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table to squeeze her grandfather's hand. His words settled over me like a balm, steadying me in ways I hadn't realized I needed. When we returned home, the house felt heavier with Mark's presence. He sat in the darkened living room, staring at the blank television screen. "You've ruined me," he whispered as we passed. I stopped in the doorway, meeting his shadowed gaze. "No, Mark. You ruined yourself. I simply stopped covering for you." His jaw tightened, but he had no response. I guided Lily upstairs, shutting her door, gently determined to shield her from the bitterness spilling through the walls. In the days that followed, the shift became undeniable. Friends who once praised Mark's charm no longer called. Invitations dried up. His name, once spoken with admiration at community gatherings, now carried a sharp edge of disdain. I carried myself with quiet steadiness, never confirming or denying details, allowing the truth to speak for itself. The world he had built on lies had crumbled, leaving him with nothing to stand on. And as I watched the pieces of his facade fall away, I felt no triumph, only a calm certainty. Justice had not come loudly, but it had arrived all the same. And though the path ahead would still hold challenges, I knew the balance had shifted for good. The question lingering now was how I would shape the life that followed once the dust of his downfall had finally settled. The days after Mark's downfall felt strangely quiet, as though the house itself had exhaled. The constant hum of his phone calls, the slamming of doors, the sharp words that once filled every corner, had all gone. In their place was silence, not heavy this time, but steady, almost tender. I realized I could breathe again, and the air no longer carried the sourness of lies. Lily noticed it too. She laughed more freely at dinner, no longer glancing nervously between us, waiting for the tension to break. She played music while doing her homework, her voice carrying through the hallways, and for the first time in months, I let myself join her. One evening, we danced in the kitchen while spaghetti boiled on the stove, our laughter rising above the clatter of pots. It was ordinary, but in that ordinariness, I found something sacred. Walter remained a steady presence, visiting on weekends, sometimes just sitting with me on the porch while Lily studied inside. He didn't speak often about Mark, and I was grateful. Instead, he reminded me with small gestures, a hand resting briefly over mine, a word of encouragement that family could still mean safety. I understood then that loyalty wasn't blind defense of wrong, but standing beside the ones who chose truth. As for Mark, he moved into a small apartment across town. His calls grew less frequent, his words shifting from anger to something closer to defeat. I didn't answer most of them. I had nothing left to say. The world he had built on charm and deception had crumbled, and I no longer felt responsible for gathering the pieces. Justice had already been delivered, not by my hand alone, but by the weight of his own choices finally being seen. Tessa faded from our lives quickly after her contracts were stripped away. I heard whispers of her leaving the city for a fresh start, somewhere no one knew her name. I didn't wish her well, nor did I wish her harm. She had taken what she wanted at my expense, but in the end, she lost more than she gained. That was enough. In the months that followed, I focused on the simple parts of life I had neglected. I spent Saturday mornings at the farmer's market with Lily filling our bags with peaches and fresh bread. I returned to painting an old hobby I had let slip away when I was too busy smoothing over Mark's lies. Each brushstroke felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had been buried under years of compromise. The greatest shift, though, was internal. I no longer carried the fear of what others thought or the weight of keeping up appearances. I had stood in a crowded ballroom and spoken the truth without raising my voice. And I had watched the consequences unfold. That night taught me something I will never forget. You don't always need to shout to be heard. Sometimes dignity held steady speaks louder than anger ever could. Life has not been perfect since then, but it has been mine, honest, steady, and free of pretense. I watch Lily growing into a young woman, and I pray she carries this lesson with her. Love should never ask you to shrink or to silence your own worth. Real partnership stands on respect, not secrecy. Looking back, I don't regret the years I gave. They shaped me, they shaped her, and they led me here to a life where I know my strength is not dependent on anyone else's choices. Justice came in its own time, not with noise, but with clarity. And dignity once reclaimed cannot be taken again. Before we close, I'd love to know, has there been a moment in your own life when quiet strength spoke louder than anger? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for keeping me company through this story.